My name is Chester. I'm 67 years old, and I carry on my shoulders a lifetime of silence. But there's a story that doesn't leave me alone, and that to this day makes me wake up at night looking at the ceiling. Tell me something. What would you do if you knew your daughter was about to marry a man who just wanted to know what she could give, and not of what is it? In that winter of 2024, the cold cut more than usual here in Sioux City. Kayla, my only daughter, showed up with that twinkle in her eye saying she was getting married. I smiled. On the outside. Because inside, something didn't fit. The groom, Brandon, had a limp handshake and a smile that didn't reach the eye. And most importantly, he didn't know about my father's will. Money, $9 million. If you've ever had to hide a secret that's too big to protect someone you love, you'll understand what I've experienced. And if you haven't been through it yet, it's better to know now there is silence that saves, because at the end of this story, you'll find out why being silent was the only way to scream. But before we dive into the heart of this story, I need you to know something. There was a day, a few days before the wedding, when Brandon and his mother broke into my house as if they owned everything. They didn't come with hugs or with an invitation. They came with a notary and a roll. They demanded my signature, talking about family assets, conjugal rights, as if I was just an obstacle between them and what they thought was rightfully theirs. I looked into the eyes of both of them and said a sentence. Only one. And that was enough. His hands trembled, his eyes ran away from mine. But this is just the beginning. If you've come this far, maybe it's because you've felt that tightness in your chest, of being used, pushed to the corner, treated as an obstacle by those you helped lift. If that's your case, then stay with me, because today I'm going to open my heart. And if this outburst touches on any part of your story, give me a sign that I'm not talking to myself. Leave your like, subscribe to the channel, comment below where you are listening. I promise I'll tell you everything, but calmly. Because there are stories that hurt even to remember. It was on a January night, one of those when the wind seems to want to rip people's souls out of the window. Kayla came home with a beautiful package in her hands. "Dad, it's time to make it official," she said, with that smile of someone who still believes that everything will work out. She handed out the wedding invitation as if handing out a medal, and for a moment, just for a moment, I wanted to believe along with her. But it was enough to open the envelope for the weight of the paper to squeeze my chest. There was his name, Brandon Whitaker. I had heard of that name, and not in a good way. I didn't want to spoil her joy, so I put the envelope in the drawer like someone hiding a dangerous letter. But inside, a different cold began to visit me. A cold that did not come from winter outside, but from inside. Of fear. Of the presentiment. Because when we've lived a long time, we smell danger in the air even before it knocks on the door. She invited me to dinner at their new home, one of those modern homes in a new neighborhood of Sioux City, full of fake grass and rehearsed smiles. Brandon greeted us with expensive wine and a tight bicep dress shirt. He looked more like a luxury car salesman than a man about to build a life with someone. He talked too much, and when I spoke, he listened too little. "So you retired early. What good envy," he said, but with that tone that hides more judgment than praise. "Nowadays no one can afford that luxury. But I understand. Another generation, other priorities." I just smiled. Because if there's one thing I've learned after burying my wife, it's that silence sometimes imposes itself better than any response. During dinner, he praised the food Kayla prepared, but amended with comments about how she still needed to learn to organize herself better. At another time, he commented on how he intended to give her a different future. That hurt me. I gave her whole life. I gave everything. But for him, it seems that my daughter came from nowhere. The worst part was when out of nowhere he blurted out, "We were thinking about making a prenuptial agreement, just to be safe, right? Not that we think it's necessary, but it is prudent. Protect what we build." I looked at Kayla. She had a nervous smile, not knowing if that was normal. "It's just to avoid problems," he reinforced. "After all, nowadays everything is so uncertain." I didn't say anything. Not there. Not in front of her. I just registered every word, every tone, every look. And allow me to pause here, because there are things that we only understand after time passes. That dinner taught me that the greatest danger doesn't always come by screaming. Sometimes he arrives polite, smiling, and sits at the table with his family. If you've been through this, if you've ever felt in your heart that someone close to you is not trustworthy, but no one wanted to listen to you, comment below with just one word. I believe. Is that it? Because there are things that we feel before it happens. Driving home that night, I drove slowly, as if the car needed to think along with me. Brandon's image came to me several times. The way he looks at me but doesn't see me. The way he held Kayla's hand as if it were a trophy. Arriving at my garage, I sat there for a few minutes with the car turned off, looking into the dark. I remembered my wife. The way she said, "Chester, our role is to protect Kayla, even when she doesn't understand." And that's what I decided to do. Protect. Even if it was in silence. Even if they called me exaggerated. That night, I opened the box where I kept my father's will papers. I read it all over again. The inheritance, the real estate, the accounts. And my father's last words, "Use it wisely, protect your daughter, and never trust those who come asking what you have." I closed the box, I locked it again, and I thought to myself, they won't know anything. But I just didn't imagine that this boy wasn't even going to wait for the wedding to happen to try to get his claws on what wasn't his. What he did days later, I'll never forget it, and neither will you. Because it was at that moment that I was sure my daughter was in the wrong hands. But what he didn't know was who he was dealing with. After that dinner, things started to change. Very slowly, almost imperceptible, like rust that corrodes from the inside before appearing on the outside. Kayla no longer called me as often. When I called, it was just to let you know something practical. "Dad, let's change the wedding venue, okay? Brandon found a better space. Best. Or more expensive. Or farther away from me." I just replied that it was fine, because I learned that sometimes insisting is the shortest way to lose for good. Soon after that, I was invited to visit their new house, a modern house, with a white wall that seems to have never been touched by a sweaty hand. I arrived at the scheduled time. I waited in the car, as I always do when I arrive early. Only time passed. 10, 15, 30 minutes. An hour, and nothing. When Kayla finally came to the car, she didn't seem to remember the time. "Sorry, Dad. We were with the broker, solving some pending issues." I smiled, as if understanding. But inside, a knot has formed. I had never been the one waiting in the car. I was the one who cared for, who solved, who protected. Now, he was just the old man in the front seat. At the next dinner, I went to Brandon's parents' house. Loretta greeted me with that smile that doesn't touch her eyes. Table set, French wine, cloth napkins, all very elegant. She struck up a conversation all the time, trying to appear kind, but each sentence came with an iron tip. "Chester, you raised Kayla with a lot of dedication. This is admirable. But now she is entering another stage, with a new family, new values. It's their turn to take the reins, isn't it?" I looked at my daughter, waiting for a gesture, a look, a defense. But she just lowered her eyes and drank the wine. That night, I returned home with a mute heart. And for the first time, I felt that I no longer fit in her life. I saw myself as that old sofa that we lean against in the garage. It's there, it was useful, it has history, but now hinders. I, who was floor, ceiling, food and hug, now it was just one name on the guest list. And yet, even though I felt all this, I didn't say anything. I didn't cry, I didn't fight, I didn't scream. I just watched. Because silence also serves to measure the depth of the abyss between two hearts. The worst thing is that she didn't see it. Kayla didn't see it. And maybe it wasn't even her fault, because the manipulation that comes from someone we love is different. It does not arrive as a blow, it arrives as a coziness. Brandon knew this. He was good at it. I knew how to occupy all the spaces between me and my daughter until there was no air left for me. And I saw it happening. I saw my daughter leaving, even though he was in front of me. And this is where something comes in that I need to say. If you have ever felt that you were being removed, little by little, from the life of someone you created with love, with presence, with sacrifice, so you understand what I experienced, and he understands me in silence, because sometimes we just want a place to continue existing, but even that they take from us. Brandon was still going to show who he really was, but what he did next, it moved not only me, but everything I believed about family. That's when I understood. He didn't just want my daughter. He wanted to erase my existence and transform everything I built into something disposable. But it will be that he was prepared for what I had already saved. My father's name was Harold, a man of few words, but of gestures that marked more than any speech. I grew up watching him make silence a compass. When he didn't speak, it was because something important was coming. On Sundays, we went fishing in a small lake hidden among some trees 2 hours from here. He never taught you to hook the fish in a hurry. Let it come, Chester. He who is hungry comes to you. This phrase stuck in my head like a whisper that time doesn't take. And in the basement of the old house, between account books and a chessboard that we barely used, he said something else, which today sounds almost like a prophecy. Protect what is yours. And protect your daughter from what she doesn't see. At the time, it seemed like just father's advice. But today, every syllable of these words weighs like iron on my chest. When my father left, everything was very fast, silent as he always lived. The call from the hospital came on a grey morning, and in less than a week I was already organizing the wake. Kayla was on a trip with Brandon at the time, and she didn't even arrive in time to say goodbye. She texted me saying that she was sorry, but that the ticket was already purchased, and that Brandon had made plans in advance. That hurt, but I swallowed it, as always. Days after the burial, I received an envelope from my father's lawyer, Mr. McAllister. Inside was a letter in my old man's firm handwriting. No flourishes, no sentimental goodbye, only clear instructions. You will find the documents in the Omaha safe. Everything there is yours. Use if you need to, but never announce ahead of time. I went to the bank on a cloudy Tuesday. I entered the room with the smell of old carpet and too much stored paper. When they opened the safe, I was startled. Deeds, extracts, certificates, more than $9 million. Hidden in land, shares of family businesses and old investments. It was as if my father had built a silent castle and left the key to me without warning me that one day I would have to take shelter inside. I returned home that day with the briefcase in my lap, as if carrying dynamite. I could do a lot with that, buying a new house, giving Kayla a queen's life, traveling, donating. But I did nothing. I kept everything. Because his voice still echoed, never announce ahead of time. And even more, protect your daughter from what she does not see. And at that moment, I was already sure what she wasn't seeing. Brandon was the kind of man who would smell money before he even saw the color. A sniffer of opportunity, and if he knew what I had in hand, he would make my daughter a permanent trophy, not out of love, but out of interest. And the worst, it's just that she wouldn't even notice. Because when we love, we see with the eyes of the heart. That's it. This can be a danger. I began to observe more closely. The wedding invitations arrived with names I had never heard. The guest list looked more like Brandon's professional contact book than real friends. Everything was too grandiose, too expensive, too fast. Kayla no longer asked for my opinion. I just warned. Brandon thinks it's going to be better this way. Brandon said this is more modern. Brandon saw a house in Des Moines that could make a good investment, and I was there, just listening, but inside arming myself. I kept every extract, every piece of paper in the will, every record of possession. I made copies, put them in separate envelopes, hid them in different places. Because if the time came, I wish I was ready. What if they knocked on my door with the face of angels? I wish I had the devil's tools, but still, nevertheless, I had a small, almost invisible hope that everything was just my impression, that I was wrong, that my daughter, even involved, could see it over time. But this hope began to die faster than I expected, because what happened next, it wasn't just a sign, it was a warning. One of those that fate screams in our faces for us to stop pretending we didn't understand, and when it happened, there was no longer any way to ignore it. Do you believe that there are people who are capable of looking you in the eye, smiling, and still be robbing you inside? That's that. You'll see. The invitation arrived in a white box, with satin ribbon and the smell of expensive perfume. Integration dinner between families, the card said. I thought it was unnecessary, but I went. After all, it was for Kayla. I arrived alone at the Sioux City Country Club, where the Whitakers had a captive table, a place that looked more like a movie set than a restaurant, all white, smooth, with waiters who walked as if they were floating. Brandon greeted me with an automatic smile, the kind that doesn't heat up the corner of the eye. I'm glad you came, Chester. Mom will love to get to know you better. And he took me to the table, where Loretta was already waiting for me, with glass in hand, and the air of someone who judged every detail of me, even before I sat down. So, you're the famous Chester, she said, in that Texas accent that tries to sound sweet, but scratches. I'm glad you're here. Kayla talks a lot about her father. Pause. She looked at the cutlery, as if it bored her. It's admirable for a man to raise a daughter alone. I imagine that it was not easy to keep the finances in order without a more professional. I smiled, just with my mouth, because the poison was well measured, and I already knew how to recognize this kind of compliment that pushes you down. During dinner, she would talk as if my daughter had finally found the right path. He said that Kayla was now in a more demanding circle, and that this would make her mature. Brandon chimed in, with comments such as, Kayla is learning quickly to behave at more refined events, and she is already getting the hang of dealing with people of position. And there I was, swallowing pieces of meat along with the bitter taste of disguised humiliation. At a certain point, Loretta looked at me as if measuring the value of an old piece of furniture. And you, Chester, have you ever thought about moving? This old house of yours in the old part of the city, wouldn't it be time to sell and keep up with your daughter's new standard? Brandon laughed softly, as if it was just a light joke, but I saw what was behind. It was a message. It was as if they were saying to me, without saying, you were left behind. Now it's a nuisance. I could have answered with numbers. He could have told about the inheritance, the real estate, the shares that they would never dream of having. But no, I remained silent, because silence is sometimes louder than any answer. And because my father always said, true power doesn't have to be announced, he reveals himself when he is needed. There at that impeccable table, I understood that they didn't want Kayla. They wanted to transform it, erase its origins, shape it to fit into a showcase of cheap luxury where appearances are worth more than essence. And I, who was part of her origin, it needed to be erased as well. On the way home, I drove in silence. I didn't even turn on the radio. Only the sound of the engine and my own thoughts kept me company. Kayla texted me later, saying she hoped I enjoyed the dinner. I responded with "It was good to see you," because I didn't want to pour all the pain on her. Not yet. I'm here, opening my heart, telling my story with all the truth that I carry in my chest. If you're still listening, leave a like on this video and subscribe to the channel, because I still have a lot to tell you. And maybe, hopefully, some of it will help you understand your own story as well. But you know, That night, lying in bed, looking at the ceiling, something moved inside me. That wasn't just a dinner. It was a warning, a preparation, because what would come next, it would be even more cruel and more direct. Can you believe that the next day my daughter didn't even invite me to the rehearsal of his own wedding? And that's when I started to really disappear. The wedding rehearsal was on a Friday. I only knew it happened because I saw the photos on my cell phone later. Kayla didn't warn me. No call, no invitation, just a short message, hours later. Dad, the organization was a mess. I forgot to confirm you in the group. Forgive me? I read that calmly. I repeated the phrase about 3 times, trying to understand if it was really my daughter who had written it. And then I opened Instagram, something I don't even usually use. I saw everything. The photos, the videos, her smile, Brandon's arm around her waist, Loretta in a vibrant blue dress at the center of it all, being called the true soul of the ceremony. And I was nowhere to be found. It was as if it had never existed. I closed the phone. I walked to the garage, where I still keep some of my wife's boxes, clothes, notebooks, old letters she wrote to me when Kayla was little. I sat on a wooden chair, one of those very old ones which creaks when we move. I stood there for hours, just listening to the sound of the world outside. Inside, the silence was noisier. I thought about the birthdays I organized alone, the fevers I took care of at dawn, the sleepless nights waiting for Kayla to come back from college. And now I was just a forgotten name on a list, an unnecessary detail. It was on that night that I cried, but I cried in that way that only silence understands. No hiccups, no scandal. Just one tear after another, as if each one cleaned a piece of the soul that had been dusty for a long time. I wondered if I had been wrong to protect her too much, if the love I gave became such a comfortable shield that she forgot who it was that held that shield for so long. I woke up the next day with heavy eyes. Even before coffee, I received a call. It was my father's lawyer, McAllister. Mr. Chester, just confirming. Do you want to move the inheritance now? I took a deep breath. I held the phone tightly. I looked out the window. The day was clear, but inside me there was a storm. Not yet, I replied. But keep everything safe. Something tells me that soon I will have to act. I hung up and stared at nothing, because at that moment I understood that it was not just a wedding. It was deeper, dirtier, and if my daughter couldn't see what they were doing to her, so I would need to show it. But not with shouts, not with fights. Take it easy, with evidence, with intelligence. But what I didn't expect, it was that on the very day of the wedding, they would try to bury me for good, because it's one thing to be left out of a party, another very different. It is to be erased from the whole story, and that's what they tried to do to me. Do you believe that there was even a lawyer involved, even before the votes? And that's when everything started to turn. The night before the wedding arrived, as if it didn't want to be noticed. The sky was clear, but inside me everything seemed cloudy. Kayla sent me a short message. Come by later if you can. I wanted to see you first. Because even wounded, he was still a father. And even forgotten, he still loved. When I arrived, the house had few lights on. It was the first time I'd seen her like that. Decorated with fake flowers, hanging lights, rehearsed soundtracks. Everything beautiful, but cold. I knocked lightly on the door, and she opened it herself. She was wearing a baggy t-shirt, her eyes a little sunken, without makeup. "Father," she said and hugged me. But it was a different hug. A hug that seems to ask for help without using words. We entered and sat in the room. The sofa was modern but uncomfortable. Everything there seemed bought to impress, not to welcome. Kayla poured me some tea. He tried to smile. She talked about the dress, the buffet, the gift list, but none of those words had any color. It was as if she was repeating memorized lines to maintain the pose, until suddenly he blurted out, "Brandon takes care of me, Dad." I didn't say anything. I just stared. She repeated again, this time quieter. He takes care of me. Like someone who needs to convince herself. There, sitting next to her, I wanted to speak. I meant everything. Shout. Kayla, look around you. This is theatre, not home. But my father's words came back like a firm whisper. Only intervene when the game is clear. And at that moment, the game was still dark. But something inside me was already starting to light up. The way she looks at the ground, avoids talking about the future, laughs unwillingly. My daughter was not happy. She was tired, caged, and trying to protect myself from my own prison. I put my hand on her shoulder, as I did when I was a child, and woke up scared by thunder. I'll be there tomorrow, daughter, but if something goes wrong, you have nowhere to go back. She looked at me, and for a second her eyes filled with water, but she didn't let it fall. He took a deep breath, smiled weakly, and said, "Everything will be fine." I returned home with that tightness in my chest that only those who have had a love in danger know. I sat at the kitchen table, took the folder with the inheritance documents, the statements, the records. I called McAllister. "If I send you a name, can you do a quick, discreet check?" He replied, "Yes." And I just said, "Brandon Whitaker, I need to know who my daughter is marrying, and we need to know before tomorrow. There's something I want to ask you now. If you've made it this far, stay with me, because what comes next is where everything starts to change. And look, it is not an exaggeration. It's just that sometimes the whole life changes because of a phrase, an attitude, a look. And I remember exactly the moment when everything turned around. It's close, very close. That morning, I hardly slept. I walked around the house, touched on the old photos of little Kayla, remembered the birthdays in the backyard, the nights with a fever, the stories I read before she went to sleep. And now, she was going to sleep with another man, with another world. And I could only wait. But what I didn't know, on that Saturday morning, while the sun was still waking up, they knocked on my door. And who came? He didn't bring flowers. I brought papers, witnesses. It is a proposal that would change everything. Can you believe they tried to buy me, shut me up, and that's it, that they figured out who they were dealing with? The clock was still striking 7:40 in the morning when I heard 3 dry knocks on the door. I didn't expect anyone at that time, much less on the wedding day. I opened it slowly, and there they were, Brandon in a light suit, a restrained smile, calculating eyes, and next to him a middle-aged man in a tie, holding a leather briefcase. "Chester," Brandon began, that slurred voice trying to sound cordial, "I know today is an important day, and for that very reason, we brought here a small formality." Before I asked anything, Loretta emerged from the side of the car in a light blue dress, the same shade as the decoration from the night before. "Good morning, Chester. Don't worry. This is just to make everyone's life easier. You'll understand." They entered my house, as if entering a land already purchased. Brandon held out an envelope toward me. "It is a term of recognition of family intention. Nothing much. It only serves to formalize the intention to keep everything organized for the future. Kayla will have the Whitaker family name now, and, well, we know you're a far-sighted man." I sat slowly in the armchair in the living room and opened the envelope. I read each line calmly, not because I didn't understand, but because I wanted them to think I was processing it for the first time. That document talked about present and future assets arising from family ties, about inheritances by affinity, and even a clause hidden in the footer mentioning the tacit authorization for the movement of inherited assets with the prior consent of the son-in-law in case of disability or absence of the original owner. I looked up and looked at him. Brandon crossed his arms with that air of someone who was already starting the yacht. Loretta pretended to adjust the strap of her bag, but waited for my reaction with her eyes fixed on me. I took a deep breath, raised. I took a slow walk around the room. Then I smiled. "Do you want me to sign now?" Brandon smiled too, as if he had already won. That would be great, Chester. That way there is no pending for Kayla's future. Loretta added, it avoids legal problems, you know. We just want to protect the family. So I went to the landline, the one on the kitchen wall that I still use as a habit. I dialed the number by heart. On the other side, a familiar voice answered, McAllister. And I said, very clearly, it's time to open the safe. Brandon turned pale. Loretta gasped in the air itself, and I continued, still with the phone in my hand. You can provide everything. Today, now. I hung up, turned slowly to the three of them, and said, you don't know who you messed with. They stood still. Brandon tried to compose his face, but his hand trembled. Chester, what exactly do you mean by that? I sat back in the armchair. I want to say that my father died with his name cleared, his assets all in order, and that he left me a will with clear instructions. One of them was to never sign anything on impulse, and another, never trust those who arrive with a smile and paper in hand. Loretta stepped forward, her voice shaking a little. No one is here to deceive anyone. It's just a document, Chester, for Kayla's sake. I stared at her. No, it's for your good, because Kayla's sake. You have already passed over it, and she didn't even notice. And if there's one thing that hurts, that's it. To see his own daughter being used as a bridge. And worse, see that she believes what they are saying, which she calls protection, what is actually control. Sometimes we raise someone with so much love that they forget that the world is not always made of that. If you understand this pain, if you've ever felt someone in your own family being pulled away by smiling hands, with pretty promises and rotten intentions, comments below. He only writes, I understand you, because this pain has no name, but there is a lot of company. Brandon took the document back, now embarrassed. Sorry, Chester. We can leave it for later. I didn't answer. I only watched them leave one by one, quieter than they arrived. When they closed the door, I went to the safe in the room and took out the papers, the originals, the copies, the extracts. Today was not just my daughter's wedding. It was the day when the truth would begin to leak out, slowly, through the smiles. Because what they didn't know, it's just that while they were trying to fold me with pen and paper, I had already started to write another ending. And this ending, he was going to be remembered by everyone who was in that church. Have you ever seen a marriage interrupted for a secret? So just wait to see what happened at the altar. 2 days after the wedding, I was still trying to swallow everything that happened. The ceremony had been an impeccable staging, with too many flowers, photographers everywhere, and applause that seemed to come out of a script. But what struck me the most were not the fake votes or the forced smiles. It was the emptiness in my daughter's eyes. At the altar, she looked at me only once, fast. But in that look I saw something that no one there seemed to notice. It was as if she said, Dad, is there still time? The following Tuesday morning, while I was sipping my unsweetened black coffee, as I have since my wife was gone, my phone rang. It was her, but not in the way I used to call. It was a cry, a sobbing crossed, and just 3 words which hit my ear like a fire siren. Seek me, Father. I dropped everything, took the keys and left without even putting on my shoes properly. The rain was pouring down, wetting the sidewalks of Sioux City as if to clean up the traces left by that dirty history. I drove too fast for my age, but the fear of being late spoke louder. She texted me the address, a narrow street near Interstate 29, where the couple's first rented apartment was located. When I turned the corner, I saw it. She was sitting on the curb, soaking wet, 2 suitcases by her side, and a face that was no longer my daughter's. It was that of a tired, injured, groundless woman. I stopped the car and ran to her. Kayla stood up slowly, her eyes red, and collapsed into my arms. I felt his shoulders tremble as if his whole body trembled inside. He's changed, Dad. He has changed. Right after the wedding, I was silent, just holding her, protecting as I could. He screamed, disappeared for hours, emptied the joint account, and today I found his phone unlocked. There was a message with Loretta, saying that now, with the paperwork ready, I just had to wait for you to die. Her sentence tore me inside, but I stood firm. She needed ground, not more chaos. I put the bags in the trunk, opened the passenger door, and we left without looking back. She didn't ask where we were going. I knew that anywhere I was would be safer than that luxury prison. At home, I took a hot bath, made chamomile tea like her mother did, and sat next to her on the couch while she told me everything. He said I was ungrateful if I asked about money, that now the family was his, that I had to trust him as a wife, but he was already meeting another woman, Dad, and Loretta. She knew. She encouraged it. There was even a message from her saying that it was good for me to get used to betrayal from an early age, because men of power are like that. I listened to everything, and every word was like a needle going through a piece of my past with it. The little girl with the braid, who made beaded bracelets for me, now felt ashamed of herself for having believed too much. I held his hand tightly. "You're safe now, and I'll take care of the rest, with silence, with class, but without mercy." She looked at me as if she were hearing my voice for the first time. "Dad, you knew, right?" I nodded with my eyes. I knew. But sometimes knowledge is a weight that we carry quietly, waiting for the right time to protect without destroying. And now, the right time had come, because Brandon and Loretta thought they had won. They thought they could erase me from her story with roles and manipulations. But what they didn't know, it's just that safe that my father left kept more than an inheritance. He kept ammunition, and at that moment, I knew exactly how to use it. Can you believe that, even after everything, they still tried one last desperate move to maintain control? That's that, and what they didn't expect was that I also had my allies, because when a father decides to really protect, there is no game that can resist his silence, and the answer, it came in the form of justice. That morning, after Kayla slept from exhaustion in the bedroom where she grew up, I was left alone in the kitchen. The kettle was beeping on the stove, but my head was elsewhere, in time, in what I was, in what I almost lost. He stirred the coffee calmly, looking out the window at the fog rising slightly over the yard. I thought about how many times I dreamed of that future, to see my daughter happy, married, but with someone who deserved her. And now she had returned home with her suitcases, her eyes withered and her heart in pieces, but I'm glad he came back. She woke up a few hours later with a swollen face, but with more color. We sat on the sofa in the living room without haste. She didn't want to talk about Brandon or Loretta. I wanted to understand. "Dad, why didn't you ever tell me about Grandpa Harold's heritage?" I looked at her as if looking at a wound that she already knows how to take care of. "Because that was to protect you, not to give you, and I had to wait for the right time." She swallowed. "And when would that time be?" I took a deep breath. "When you were in real danger, when your life was at stake, even if you didn't see yet." Kayla cried again, but it was a different cry, more mature, mixed with anger at herself, and an apology that didn't need to be said. "I was blind, Dad. I let him change me. I left you aside." I held her hand. "You're back, and that's all that matters." She asked me in a weak voice if there was still time to annul the marriage. He said he didn't want a penny from him, that he just wanted peace back. And there, sitting in that room full of memories, I made the decision. I wasn't going to let that go, but it wasn't going to get our hands dirty either. Now, my daughter, we will do it the right way, in court. With facts, no scandal, but with everything. I went up to my office, picked up the blue folder with my father's contacts. Lawyers, accountants, old friends from his days still doing business in Omaha. I called McAllister, who had been on standby since the day of the Whitakers' visit. "Turn on hidden background, that of the First Central Bank, and get me the best lawyer you have for family disputes." The next day, I went to Omaha in person. 3 hours on the road and a lot on my mind. I walked into the office of Elena Vasquez, a woman with her hair tied up, eyes of someone who has seen many little games fall apart. I handed over the documents, the screenshots of the messages Kayla found on Brandon's cell phone, the hidden clauses in the contract that they tried to get me to sign. She didn't need much time to understand. They counted on your silence, Mr. Chester, but now it's our turn to speak. I returned home with a calm that I hadn't felt in weeks. Because finally, the tide had begun to turn, and not by screaming, not by revenge, but for justice, silent but accurate. If this piece of my life can become a mirror or a hug for someone, help me carry it forward. Like and subscribe here to the channel. It makes more difference than you think. And look, there's still a lot I need to tell you, because behind the scenes of this facade marriage, they had proofs, rotten alliances, and even money that disappeared. And when the lawyer pulled the right thread, their castle began to crumble. Can you imagine who was the first to despair? I'll tell you next time. And I'll tell you, it wasn't Brandon. It was Elena who suggested, with that look of someone who already knew where this was going, Chester, if we're going to court, we need more than clues. We need proof, real and well documented. She gave me the name of a man who, according to her, was not only efficient, he was ruthless. Hank Malone. Former police officer, he worked for 25 years in the Financial Crimes Division. He retired early, but never quit the profession. Now it investigates family fraud, and he never lost a case. I called that same afternoon. Hank answered me in a dry, objective voice. If it's to dig up dirt, you need to give me everything, no filter. And I did. I gave copies of the documents, photos, screenshots of the messages, Brandon and Loretta's full names, and most importantly, dates. They started acting on such and such a day. Here's everything they tried to get me to sign. He didn't say anything. He only replied, I'm going to start in Texas. That's where money usually hides. Meanwhile, Kayla was in charge of gathering all the wedding paperwork. Certificate, civil registration, buffet contracts, guest list, everything that could be used to contest the validity of the union. Sometimes I looked at her and saw my girl back. But there were days when she cried in her room and apologized quietly, as if it was her fault for everything. I never judged. He only said every time, the mistake was not to love. It was trusting those who didn't love you back. Hank started sending weekly reports. I read everything alone, in the living room, with the light low and a notebook on my lap. First came the transfer trails. 3 bank transactions made by Loretta in the last 2 months, sending small amounts to a legal account in the name of a shell company in Austin. Then came the real estate records. 3 houses bought and sold quickly in different names, but all linked to Brandon's acquaintances. Oranges, as Hank called it. In one of the reports, I saw a line that made me freeze. Possible meeting with a notary to create a false will. The anger it gave was great, but I couldn't lose my mind. They were already used to those who shout. They did not know how to deal with those who act in silence. And each discovery was a new piece that I fit on the board, calmly, as I learned playing chess with my father in the basement of the house, because they opened up a dangerous game, and now they were going to play against someone who had spent his whole life building in silence. One day, Hank called me straight. Chester, I need you to see this in person. I went to his office in an inconspicuous building with no signs in downtown Omaha. He showed me a video. Brandon sitting in a cafe talking to an older man. The audio was bad, but I could understand a phrase. If the old man signs, we speed up the process, and Kayla doesn't need to know anything. Hank paused the video. That man there is Thomas Kent, a notary investigated 3 years ago for falsifying patrimonial documents. And guess what? He was the same one who took that contract to his house. I stared at the screen for long seconds. Then he smiles. That's what we needed. There are moments in life when we feel, deep in our chest, that we are getting close to something big. I felt it. as if each page turned was one step closer to the day when everything would turn upside down. If you've made it this far, stay with me, because what this investigator found on Loretta's cell phone, everything changed. And you won't believe who else was involved. I found it hard to believe myself when Hank showed up again, this time at my door and with a black briefcase under his arm. I already knew big stuff was coming. He wasn't one to come in person. He preferred emails, calls, everything discreet. But that day he made a point. He sat in front of me with the expression of someone carrying dynamite and said bluntly, "They forged your signature, Chester. And they used it to file a fake contract at a Cedar Rapids notary's office." I was silent for a while. I took the briefcase, opened it calmly. There were copies of documents, screenshots of emails, photos of the official record, and even a security camera video. Brandon and Loretta entering the registry office with papers in hand, leaving 40 minutes later smiling. The contract? An alleged partial transfer of assets, dated retroactively to the marriage, indicating that I, Chester Harold Whitaker, had authorized the release of part of my inherited assets to a joint account of Brandon and Kayla. The stamp was there. The signature. It was mine. But it wasn't. It was a grotesque imitation, a cheap forgery. "How did they manage to register this?" I asked. Hank pointed out a name on the copy of the document. Roger T. Collins, scribe and conniver. He is already being investigated for 2 other similar cases. It's selling authenticities to those who pay well. I took a deep breath. It wasn't anger that I felt at that moment. It was something else. A dangerous kind of calm. The one we only feel when we realize that the enemy has dug his own hole, and now we just need a push. I shared the dossier with Elena the next morning. She has barely finished reading and has already started typing the request for nullity of the contract. "We will attach an attempt at asset fraud, misrepresentation, use of false document and indirect coercion." I nodded silently. "Chester, do you have any idea what that means? Not only did they try to trick you, they tried to deceive the state. This goes beyond your heritage. This is now a crime." I returned home with the briefcase in my hands and found Kayla sitting on the backyard deck, reading an old book of her mother's. I sat next to her, handed over the papers and waited. She read everything, in silence. When he finished, he dropped it on his lap and muttered, "I was just a bridge for them, a means." I looked at her. He said nothing. I just stayed there. My silence weighed more than any scolding, because there are things that don't need to be said, and she understood. There, at that moment, a memory came to me of the day she was born. I remember holding her in my arms for the first time and promising, even without saying it out loud, that I would do anything for her, that I would protect her from anything. And now, so many years later, I was fulfilling that promise, in a way I never imagined I would need. No, there are memories that we don't forget. It doesn't matter how many years pass, how much pain comes after. Some images get stuck deep inside us. The smell of her first day of school, the way she said "Daddy" when she was 2 years old, the nights she slept on my chest after her mother left. All this still lives here. What about you? Which memory accompanies you to this day? Share it here in the comments. Sometimes the memory of one can ignite the heart of another. It can become a lighthouse. Now everything was ready. Elena was going to file the papers the following week. Justice would be triggered. But I knew it wasn't going to be quiet for long. Brandon and Loretta were going to find out. And when they found out, someone was going to try to look for us. And who came first? It was not who I expected. Not by a long shot. That night arrived loaded. The sky over Sioux City was low, dark, the light rain pounding the windows like nervous fingers. I was in the kitchen, preparing a soup for Kayla, when I heard the sound that made me freeze inside, tires braking in front of the house. Soon after, heavy knocks on the door. 3. Then 2 more. As if someone wanted to break the wood with their fists. I dropped the ladle into the sink, wiped my hands on the cloth and went to the door. Kayla appeared in the hallway. pale. "Father." I just raised my hand, asking for silence. "Stay here." He doesn't open his mouth. I opened the door, and the wind brought the smell of wet asphalt and anger. Brandon was there, wet, his hair stuck to his forehead, his shirt rumpled, his eyes red. He had been drinking. I knew that look. It was the same one I saw years ago in A Man Who Lost Everything at a poker table. "Where is she?" he shouted. "Do you think you can hide my wife from me, you decrepit old man?" I didn't answer. I just took a step outside and closed the door behind me. The rain began to fall harder, splashing on my shoulders. The light from the streetlight illuminated only half of his face, but he could see all that mattered. Fear disguised as fury. "You think you can steal it from me, right?" he spat. "Do you think you're going to keep everything? I know you're up to something, I know." I stood there, looking into his eyes, as if searching for a background that never existed. His voice trembled, and it wasn't cold. It was one of despair. "She was my chance, my safety. You don't know what you're doing, old man." It was then that I spoke. Low, without raising the tone, but every word weighed like a stone. "You underestimated the woman I raised, Brandon. He thought he could use her love as a tool. He thought he could buy respect with rehearsed smiles and expensive suits. But my daughter is not a coin, and now you will pay, penny by penny, and it will be the most painful way, losing everything. First the name, then the comfort. Finally, silence. You'll remember me every time you open an account and it's blocked." He took a step forward, as if he was going to face me, but stopped. His face contorted into a grimace of hatred, his fists clenched. "You won't come out on top, old man. I'm going to finish you off. With her. With everything." I didn't answer. I just looked. And I looked at it, with that kind of calm that you don't learn in youth, the one that comes after losing a lot, burying those you love, knowing the bitter taste of injustice. Brandon yelled an expletive, turned his back and got into the car. He struck tire on the way out, throwing mud on the sidewalk like a spoiled boy trying to scare those who have seen war. I went back inside slowly. I closed the door carefully, turned the key. When I turned around, Kayla was at the top of the stairs, her face pale, her eyes wide. It started, but it didn't end. "He showed who he really is," I said. "And that's why, daughter, that we will win." She walked down the steps slowly, stopped in front of me. For the first time in days, I saw something in her eyes that I recognized. Strength. "Dad, I'm ready. Do whatever it takes. I just don't want to live in fear anymore." And that's what I needed to hear. Because when courage returns to the heart of those who have been hurt, the rest is just a matter of time. But before Brandon falls, someone still needed to show up. Someone I didn't expect to see so soon. And when she knocked on my door, her eyes full of tears, I knew that the tables had turned completely. 2 days after that night in the rain, I sat next to Kayla at Elena's desk. The air in the office was thick, full of paperwork, silence and decisions. Elena placed the document in front of us. It was more than a divorce petition. It was a clean, precise surgical cut. There were listed all the evidence gathered: betrayal, fraud, emotional manipulation, falsification of documents, attempted usurpation of assets, and along with it, a formal request for the annulment of any contract signed under duress and the inclusion of a restraining order against Brandon. I looked at my daughter. She held the pen with a trembling hand, her eyes moist but firm. And when he signed, it was as if a door had closed forever. No keys, no regrets. That same week, the first rumors began to circulate in Sioux City. Loretta, as expected, began to use her tongue as a weapon. "Kayla is unstable, emotionally fragile. Chester manipulated her from the beginning. It was all a scam to hide bankruptcy from their family. I heard about it from the neighbors, from the owner of the grocery store, even from the pastor of the church who called me in a corner and said, 'They're talking, Chester. Do you want me to say something from the pulpit on Sunday?' I shook my head. "No, I have something stronger than words, proof." I have not responded to Loretta publicly. I didn't lower my level to hers. What I did was move the pieces, like in a game of chess. One movement at a time, slow, silent, accurate. Hank already had everything documented. Eleanor began sending legal notices to everyone involved in the forged contracts. And I, on the outside, contacted 2 real estate agencies where Brandon still had relationships. I discreetly shared the documents that proved the frauds without any request. Just as a warning, check carefully who represents you. 2 weeks later, Brandon was fired from one of the city's largest brokerage firms. Reason: professional misconduct. His reputation began to crumble from the inside out. Customers disappeared, partnerships were terminated, and rumors, those yes, true, began to take space. Meanwhile, here at home, Kayla was rebuilding. Little by little, she cooked with me, read her mother's old books, spent more time in the garden, but he still cried some nights. And that's okay. Healing takes time. I just said, cry, but don't blame yourself, because she needed to understand that it was never her fault. It was from illusion and the malice of others. On one of those silent afternoons, while I was sweeping the porch and she watered the plants, she stopped, leaned against the hose and said, "Dad, how did you manage not to scream? Not hitting anyone? Not to explode?" I looked at her, took a deep breath and said, "Each silence of mine carries a play. I didn't need to scream. I needed to win." And that was it. To win, not in the sense of humiliating, but in protecting. To show that it is still possible to overthrow evil without getting dirty. And that's what bothers people like Loretta the most, when there's no scandal, no fight, only consequence. But not everything was resolved, because when they mess with people like Loretta, we learn that there is always a hidden letter, and hers arrived at my door, inside a beige envelope, and signed by someone I never thought would turn against me. The letter arrived on a grey morning. Thick envelope, sender from a law firm I already knew, not out of respect, but because I knew the type of client they defended. I sat on the chair on the porch with my coffee, opened it slowly, and read line by line. Brandon had filed a lawsuit against Kayla, alleging abandonment of home, emotional damage, breach of marital duty. A complete theatre, worthy of someone who is trying to turn the board after having lost all the pieces. But what he didn't know, or pretended to forget, is that Elena had already filed everything before, with dates, evidence, prints, witnesses, each step documented as if it were a timeline of truth. The judge was firm. He refused Brandon's lawsuit on the spot. He called it an attempt to reverse the narrative, legal manipulation, and he left it on record that, if there was a new attempt without basis, they could respond for litigation in bad faith. I learned all this from Elena, of course, but what caught my attention the most was her last sentence on that call. "They're surrounded, Chester, and they know it." Days later, another movement came. Loretta, this time with a very different tone. An offer of settlement, according to her lawyer. A text full of fine words: civilized separation, preservation of the image of families, peaceful resolution. I read that paper and laughed, not mockery, but of those who understand, once and for all, that certain people only know how to talk about peace when they are losing. I answered in the only way I could. I handwrote a short letter, which I sent through my lawyer. He said, "There is nothing more to negotiate. You have dug your own end, and now they will know the depth of the hole they have opened." A few days later, Brandon was summoned to testify officially. The prints of the messages with the notaries, the bank records, and the falsified contracts had been attached. Justice began to move, and fast. The news spread. The local media, which until then had been ignorant of the case, began to sniff out the details. A well-known real estate agent involved in family fraud and extortion attempts. The first articles came out discreetly, but it only took a week for the story to take shape. "Silent scandal shakes Sioux City's elite," read one of the headlines. "No, there are things that we live and keep, but maybe by telling, we help another heart to breathe." If this story is touching you in any way, enjoy this video and subscribe here to the channel. Sometimes what we carry alone can be the relief of someone on the other side, and I still have a lot to tell. Because, you see, when it all started, I thought my job was to protect my daughter. But what I didn't imagine is that this story would expose something much bigger, something that involved other families, other names, and a buried truth that no one expected to see in the light of day. And when that name appeared in the records, even Eleanor lost her breath. That morning, the skies of Sioux City were clear, a cold, direct blue, as if time itself knew that that day would be definitive. I put on my best shirt, the one I kept after my wife's funeral, and walked to the courthouse. I arrived early, sat in the back row as I have always done in my life, watching before acting. I haven't spoken to anyone. I just stood there, quiet, with my hands clasped in my lap and my heart beating slowly but firmly. Kayla entered through the side door, accompanied by Elena. She walked upright, but you could see that inside she was shaking. I knew it. Each step there carried the weight of everything she swallowed in silence, every tear, every doubt, every sleepless night. But she was standing, and that alone was victory. The judge arrived, a serious, direct man with no patience for spectacle. He read the record slowly but accurately. Document fraud, attempted embezzlement, emotional coercion, intention to improperly obtain family assets. With each item, Brandon sank deeper into his chair, and Loretta, Loretta, sitting with what was left of her haughtiness, now without her high heels, with heavy makeup trying to hide her fear. But he didn't hide anything. Hank was called. The old detective got up and walked to the center of the room with that way of someone who has seen a lot and is not easily scared. He opened the folder and began to present extracts, prints, recorded calls, testimonies. But it was when he pressed the button on the recorder that silence turned to steel. Loretta's voice filled the room, cold, calculating. "If we take this inheritance through marriage, then we get rid of it. Kayla is no problem. It's just a step." I closed my eyes. That hurt. More than I imagined. Not for me, for her. Because no daughter deserves to hear from her own mother-in-law that she's just a disposable object. I looked at Kayla, and I saw her eyes filling, but not with tears of sadness, with dignified anger. That kind of anger that doesn't scream, that doesn't break a plate. The one that rebuilds. The judge took the floor, and with the same coldness with which he read the accusations, he decreed the divorce, with total loss of any rights for Brandon. No sharing, no access, no advantage, only ruin. And it also ordered the opening of a criminal investigation against the two, Loretta and Brandon, for attempted asset fraud. The room fell silent. The journalists began to leave in a hurry to turn on the recorders. People whispered, surprised. But I stood still. I didn't smile at all. No celebration. I just lowered my eyes and breathed. I breathed like someone who finished climbing a mountain, and from up there you don't need to shout for anyone to hear, because silence is sometimes the greatest cry for justice. You're the one listening to me so far. Listen to what I'm going to tell you. The world changes, the laws change, the words change. But one thing never changes, the weight of the truth when it comes to light. And if you think that was the end, you're wrong. Because after the trial came the part that surprised me the most. An envelope, a letter, and a truth about my own father that it took me almost 70 years to understand. The weeks following the trial seemed quieter than all the noise that came before, but it was a good silence. That kind of silence that comes after heavy rain, when the air gets cleaner and the earth is grateful. Gradually, I learned the consequences. Brandon lost his broker's license. The state's regulatory commission cancelled his registration for unethical conduct and repeated fraud. No license, no reputation, no market. Loretta, on the other hand, was kindly asked to withdraw from the social club that she was so keen to show off. The same ladies who clapped for her dresses at brunch now turned their faces in the market. The house where they lived, which was registered in the name of a ghost company linked to it, entered a judicial auction process. They tried to appeal. Complained, they swore innocence, but no word of them could hold any longer. Friends moved away. Even the most self-interested disappeared. Nobody wants to be close to those who lose everything. Out of greed, the neighbors commented, as expected. Who would have thought? The world goes around. They paid dearly for their arrogance. I listened, but I didn't comment. I just went on my way. Life was already giving me back the peace they tried to take away. Kayla, finally free, began to breathe again. She got a job as an administrative assistant at a local school, right there in Sioux City. Nothing grandiose, nothing brilliant, but hers. And that was enough. With Elena's help, we were able to rent a small but charming apartment near the river. She wanted to pay with her own salary. I let him. I only helped with the initial deposit and some curtains that her mother loved. For the rest, I let her feel like she owns her own story again. On Sundays, she came to dinner with me. Sometimes we talked a lot, others, almost nothing, but the silence between us was never empty. It was presence, it was forgiveness, it was a reunion, that reunion that only happens when the pain has already become a learning experience. One of those nights, while I was washing the dishes and she was drying, Kayla looked at me and asked softly, "Dad, you never got revenge, did you?" I stopped, wiped my hands slowly, and said, looking into her eyes, "Revenge is when we want to see the other suffer. Justice is when we see the truth come out." She kept quiet, but smiled, and I felt that there she really understood. But life, she always keeps one last letter, and mine came in an old wooden box, which Elena handed over. A box left by my father in the safe, with a letter that he asked to be opened only after everything was resolved. And when I read those words, I realized that the secret I kept was not just about money. It was about origin, about a part of our history that I myself did not know. It was a warm Sunday afternoon, with the smell of freshly brewed coffee and the sound of leaves banging on the window. Kayla sat in the armchair in the living room, barefoot, and her hair tied in a messy bun, as she did when she was a child. I brought the safety box from the basement, heavy, made of dark wood, without a digital lock, only with a key that I inherited from Harold, along with his silences. I placed the box between us, sat slowly next to it, and opened it, with a care that was not fear. It was reverence. Inside, everything was intact, the extracts of decades of investment in solid land and funds, firm signatures, purchases made in the 80s for pennies that were now worth millions. In the background, among the folded papers, a photo of us. Me, Kayla, still small on my lap, and my wife smiling next to my father, Harold. The image was of a picnic in Elk Point Park. I remembered that day well, the last one where we were all together as a whole family. Kayla held the photo with both hands and stared in silence. The eyes were filling until they overflowed. "Grandpa never talked about it, and neither do you. Why?" she asked, her voice choked but serene. I took a deep breath, held the yellowed envelope that was just below the photo, and replied as if carrying the answer for a long time. Because this was not supposed to be a prize. It was a shield. She looked at me, confused. I continued. "Grandpa would say, if your wealth is noisy, it attracts thieves. If it's silent, it protects those who matter." And in that instant, I think she understood. That grandfather's fortune, and my silence before her, were never about luxury or power. It was all about protecting, about waiting for the right moment, about not giving in to pride or haste. I slowly told how I lived the last few months, how every step was measured, every conversation etched in memory. As I observed, I swallowed words, retreated when the blood asked otherwise. How I held the pain in silence so that she, Kayla, would not miss the chance to see with her own eyes what was true, what was illusion. You had to fall to get back on your feet, and I just needed to be around to catch you at the right time, she cried. But it was a different cry, not of pain nor of shame. It was a cry of a new beginning, of those who see for the first time what has always been there, but lacked the maturity to see. We were both there, side by side, looking at that collection of a lifetime kept in silence by Harold. A legacy built without applause, without fanfare, but with purpose. "What now?" she asked. "What do we do with all this?" I smiled slightly, leaning my head against the armchair. "Now we live. Simple, with dignity, without fear, no secret, but with wisdom." She laughed, still a little choked, and said, "It sounds like you talking like Grandpa." I shook my head. Maybe he left more of himself than we imagined. But, like everything in life, when we think we have learned the final lesson, here is a detail, a ticket, a comma at the end of the line. Because at the bottom of the box, there was still an envelope, small, white, with my name written by hand. The lyrics were by Harold, and the content, well, the content would change everything I thought I knew about my own history. The envelope in my hands was light, but it seemed to carry the weight of a lifetime. I opened it carefully, as if I could wake my father on the other side of time. Inside, there was a short letter, 3 paragraphs, and nothing more. Harold wrote that he knew that one day I would be put to the test, that love for my daughter would be tested in ways he himself could not foresee. And he ended by saying, "The true value of a man is not in what he leaves, but in what he endures in silence until the right time to act." I folded the letter with steady hands and put it back in the box. That was it. The end and the beginning at the same time. No anger, no hurt, just that gentle peace of someone who fulfilled the most difficult promise, to protect in silence. One summer Sunday, I took Kayla with me to the lake where Harold was taking us fishing. Just the 2 of us, 2 old chairs and a radio playing softly in the back seat of the truck. We sat side by side, looking at the reflecting pool as if looking inside. She leaned her head on my shoulder, took a deep breath and said, "Dad, thank you for protecting me even when I didn't deserve it." I just smiled. I closed my eyes and let the sun hit my face, as if allowing the past to go away slowly. There, on that bank, I understood that it was no longer pain that I was carrying. It was just a pretty scar, a reminder of what resisted. Today, I'm still here, older, quieter, but whole, not with a full pocket, but with a light chest. I see my daughter starting over in her own way, with her head held high, and this is worth more than any inheritance. If there's something I've learned in all this, it's that sometimes we love so much that we need to let the other make mistakes, so that later I can support it with truth. Protecting is not holding your hand all the time. Sometimes it's letting go. But stay close. The truth, when it comes, does not need to be shouted. It comes as a belated hug, and that's when it heals. If you have listened to me so far, thank you very much, really. It may not seem like it, but opening your heart like this is hard for an old man like me. But if this story served as a mirror for your life or ignited some memory inside, it helps me spread this message. Enjoy this video. For me, this is like a hug in the middle of this walk. And if you want to come back for another coffee with me and hear more of these stories of life, subscribe to the channel. This is how we transform memories into company. And if you can, comment here from which city you are watching me. I like to imagine each story intersecting with mine in the most unexpected corners of this country. Oh, and it activates the bell, see? That way you don't lose when the coffee is brewed again. Because yes, I still have other stories in store. Some more painful, others lighter, but all with truth. Don't go away yet. Listen to the next true story that will appear on the screen. Always remember, each wrinkle tells a story, and each story carries a strength. Watch the next video here on the channel with another incredible story.